25 foods you can regrow from kitchen scraps. Free food most people miss. Before you throw those vegetable scraps into the trash today, pause for just a moment and really think about what you're tossing away. The base of a lettuce you chopped for lunch, the tiny root end of a green onion, the potato in your pantry that started growing little sprouts, the herbs that wilted before you used them. Most of us scrape these things straight into the garbage without even noticing. It feels normal, automatic, like they've already served their purpose. But what if I told you that hidden inside many of those scraps is something surprisingly powerful? Not waste, not leftovers, but the beginning of your next harvest. Because the truth is, some of the most productive plants you can grow don't start from expensive seed packets or fancy garden centers. They start from the exact pieces of food most people throw away every single day. Gardeners know this secret well. Where others see trash, they see potential. They see roots ready to grow again, stems capable of producing new leaves, seeds quietly waiting for the right conditions to become full plants. Over the years of growing food at home, I've realized something that completely changed the way I look at my kitchen. The cutting board isn't just where meals begin. It's where gardens begin too. Many common vegetables and fruits are designed by nature to regenerate. Give them a little water, a little sunlight, and just a bit of patience, and they'll start growing again right in front of your eyes. Sometimes in just a few days. And once you notice this process happening, it's honestly a little bit magical. That tiny onion root you almost tossed away suddenly sends up bright green shoots. A forgotten potato becomes a thriving plant that produces pounds of food underground. A single herb stem grows roots and turns into an entire new plant. It's one of the simplest and most satisfying ways to start growing your own food, even if you've never gardened before in your life. And in a world where food prices keep climbing and people are starting to think more seriously about self-sufficiency and sustainability, learning how to regrow food from scraps is one of the easiest skills you can pick up. It saves money, reduces waste, and slowly transforms the way you think about the food you eat every day. Instead of seeing leftovers, you start seeing opportunity. Instead of throwing things away, you start asking a different question. Can this grow again? In today's video, we're going to explore 25 kitchen scraps you should never throw away because they can regrow into fresh, real food. Some of these will surprise you with how quickly they come back to life. A few of them can keep producing for months with almost no effort. And a handful of them are so productive that one small scrap can eventually turn into an entire row of plants in your garden. If you've ever been curious about growing your own food, but felt like gardening might be too complicated or too time-consuming, this is one of the easiest places to start. Most of these plants can begin regrowing right on your kitchen windowsill with nothing more than a jar of water and a little sunlight. And once you see how simple it is, you may never look at kitchen scraps the same way again. So before you clear off the cutting board tonight and sweep those leftovers into the trash, stay with me for the next few minutes. Because one of these scraps, especially the one later in this list that almost nobody thinks about saving, might completely change the way you see food, waste, and the hidden potential sitting in your kitchen right now. Now let's start with the easiest category of all, the scraps that practically regrow themselves with almost no effort. These are the ones that make people fall in love with gardening, because the results happen so quickly that it almost feels like a small miracle happening right on your kitchen counter. If you've never tried regrowing food before, this is the perfect place to begin, because all you really need is a glass, a little water, and a spot near a window where sunlight can reach the plant. The first one on this list is something almost everyone buys regularly: green onions. If you've ever chopped green onions for soup, salad, or scrambled eggs, you probably cut off the white root ends and tossed them away without a second thought. But those little root sections are still very much alive. Instead of throwing them away, place the root ends in a small glass with just enough water to cover the roots. Then set the glass near a sunny window. Within a couple of days, something incredible begins to happen. Fresh green shoots start pushing upward again, growing taller every day, as if the plant simply decided to start over. In less than a week, you can already begin trimming the tops for cooking, and the plant will continue regrowing again and again. Many people are genuinely shocked the first time they try this, because it feels like you've discovered a tiny food machine sitting on your windowsill. If you want even better results, you can eventually transfer those rooted onions into a small pot of soil where they'll grow thicker, stronger, and last much longer. Another scrap that regrows beautifully is the base of romaine lettuce. Most people slice off the bottom of the lettuce head and throw it in the trash, but that base still contains the plant's growing center. Place it in a shallow dish with a little water and leave it somewhere with good natural light. Over the next few days, you'll notice small new leaves forming right in the middle where the original leaves were cut away. Watching this happen for the first time is oddly satisfying because the plant seems to rebuild itself piece by piece. While lettuce regrown in water usually stays smaller and lighter in color than the original head, the real trick is transplanting it into soil once the new growth gets a couple of inches tall. When you do that, the plant can continue growing into a much fuller harvest of fresh leaves. Celery works in almost exactly the same way, and it might be one of the most surprising plants to regrow from scraps. The thick base of a celery bunch is actually the heart of the plant where all the stalks originate. Instead of discarding it, place the base in a shallow bowl of water with the cut side facing upward. Within about a week, you'll start to see small pale green leaves emerging from the center, followed by new stalk growth. Once the roots begin forming underneath, you can move the plant into soil where it will continue developing into a full celery plant. And if you've only ever eaten celery from the grocery store, you might be surprised to learn that homegrown celery often has a much richer, more intense flavor. Bok choy is another vegetable that responds incredibly well to this same regrowing method. When preparing bok choy for cooking, cut the leaves a couple of inches above the base and save that bottom section. Place it in a shallow dish with water and set it somewhere sunny. In just a few days, fresh leaves begin sprouting again from the center of the base. What makes bok choy especially appealing is how quickly the new growth appears, which gives beginners a real sense of progress early on. Then there are leeks, a vegetable many people love in soups and savory dishes, but rarely think about regrowing. The root base of a leek behaves much like a green onion. Place it in a jar with a little water covering the roots, and new green shoots will begin rising from the middle within days. You can harvest the tops repeatedly while the plant continues producing more growth. Finally, there's one scrap that surprises almost everyone the first time they try it: fennel. Most people slice off the base of a fennel bulb and throw it away, never realizing that this portion can regrow delicate, feathery green fronds if placed in water. Set the base in a shallow bowl near sunlight, and watch as those soft green leaves begin emerging again from the center. These fragrant fronds carry the same light licorice flavor fennel is known for, and can be used to garnish salads, fish, and pasta dishes. When you step back and look at all these examples together, something important becomes clear. Nature has built many plants with an incredible ability to regenerate, and once you learn to recognize which scraps still contain living growth points, your kitchen suddenly becomes a place where gardens begin. What used to look like food waste starts looking more like untapped potential, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. Once you've seen how easily some vegetables regrow in water, the next category takes things a step further. Herbs that can multiply almost endlessly from simple cuttings. This is where many home gardeners discover one of the most satisfying secrets of growing food. A single plant can quietly turn into many more if you understand how plants naturally reproduce. Herbs are especially generous in this way because many of them are designed to root from stems that touch moisture or soil. In other words, the same bunch of herbs you bought at the grocery store to flavor one meal can actually become a continuous source of fresh leaves for months. One of the best examples is basil. If you've ever bought fresh basil, you've probably noticed how delicate the leaves seem once they're cut from the plant, often wilting within days if you don't use them quickly. But the stems themselves still contain powerful growing nodes capable of producing roots. Instead of throwing those stems away, take a few healthy ones about 4 inches long, Remove the lower leaves and place them in a glass of water. Within about a week, thin white roots begin to appear along the submerged parts of the stem. Once those roots grow an inch or two long, you can transplant the cutting into a pot filled with rich soil. Before long, that small cutting becomes a full basil plant, producing fresh leaves again and again. Many gardeners end up with several basil plants from a single store-bought bunch, simply by repeating this process with multiple stems. Mint behaves in an even more dramatic way. In fact, mint is famous among gardeners for its incredible ability to spread and regenerate. Take a cutting from a fresh bunch, remove the lower leaves, and place it in water. Often within just a few days, tiny roots begin forming along the stem. Once planted in soil, mint grows quickly and vigorously, producing fragrant leaves that can be harvested constantly for teas, salads, desserts, and refreshing drinks. Because mint spreads so aggressively, many gardeners prefer growing it in containers where it can expand without taking over the entire garden. Then there's cilantro, an herb loved in many cuisines around the world. Cilantro can also root from cuttings much like basil. Place trimmed stems in water and allow roots to develop before transferring them into soil. One interesting aspect of cilantro is that it has a natural life cycle that eventually leads to flowering and seed production. When cilantro flowers and forms seeds, those seeds are actually coriander, another spice used in cooking. So from one plant, you gain both fresh leaves and a completely different ingredient for your kitchen. Another herb that surprises many people is lemongrass. When purchased fresh, the lower portion of the stalk often still contains a small living base capable of growing roots. By trimming the stalk and placing the base in a jar of water, roots will slowly begin forming at the bottom, while new green growth emerges from the center. After a couple of weeks, the plant can be moved into soil where it develops into a tall, fragrant clump of grass-like leaves. Lemongrass not only adds incredible flavor to soups, teas, and curries, but it also becomes a beautiful plant to grow in containers or garden beds. What makes these herbs particularly valuable for home gardeners is how quickly they turn one purchase into many plants. Instead of buying new herb bundles every week at the store, you gradually build a small living supply right in your home. Over time, this changes the way you cook as well. Fresh herbs become something you reach for freely because they're growing just a few steps away in your kitchen or garden. And once you start propagating herbs from cuttings, you begin to notice how generous plants truly are. A single stem, something that would normally end up in the trash, carries enough life within it to create an entirely new plant. It's a quiet reminder that nature is designed for renewal. And when we learn to work with that process instead of ignoring it, even the smallest kitchen scrap can become the beginning of something far more abundant. As we move further down this list, we arrive at a group of plants that take the idea of regrowing food to an entirely different level. These are the vegetables that don't just grow again from scraps, they multiply. Instead of producing a small harvest of leaves or herbs, these crops can turn a single piece of food into several completely new plants capable of producing pounds of food over time. Once gardeners understand how these plants work, they start to realize that the food sitting in their pantry often contains the potential for an entire future harvest. A perfect example of this is the humble potato. Almost everyone has experienced the moment when a potato sits a little too long in the pantry and begins to sprout small pale shoots called eyes. Many people assume that means the potato has gone bad. But those sprouts are actually the plant preparing to grow again. Each eye is capable of developing into a new potato plant. By cutting a sprouted potato into pieces so that each section contains at least 1 or 2 eyes, you suddenly have several new plants ready to go into the soil. Once planted, those sprouts grow into leafy potato plants that produce multiple new potatoes underground. In other words, a single potato that might have ended up in the trash can turn into an entire harvest a few months later. Sweet potatoes follow a slightly different but equally fascinating process. Instead of planting pieces directly in soil, gardeners often place the sweet potato partly in water to encourage the formation of long leafy shoots known as slips. These slips grow from the surface of the potato and eventually develop roots of their own. Once they're long enough, Each slip can be gently removed and planted into soil where it becomes its own plant. One sweet potato can generate multiple slips, which means one forgotten tuber in the kitchen can eventually produce an entire patch of sweet potato vines. Garlic is another remarkable example of how plants multiply naturally. When you look at a head of garlic, you're actually looking at a cluster of individual cloves, and every one of those cloves is a complete potential plant. Plant a single clove in the soil, and over time it grows into a full garlic bulb containing several new cloves. If you save and replant some of those cloves each season, you create a cycle where your garlic supply keeps renewing itself year after year. Ginger works in a similar way, though it grows from what botanists call a rhizome. That knobby ginger root you buy at the grocery store is not technically a root at all, but an underground stem designed to expand and spread. If you look closely at a piece of ginger, you'll often see small bumps or buds along the surface. Those buds are growth points waiting for the right conditions. When a piece of ginger with one of these buds is planted into warm soil, the plant slowly begins sending up leafy shoots while the rhizome grows outward beneath the surface. Over the course of a growing season, that small piece of ginger can expand into a much larger cluster that can be harvested and replanted again. Turmeric, the vibrant golden spice used in many dishes, grows almost exactly the same way. Fresh turmeric rhizomes can be planted in soil where they slowly develop into lush plants with broad tropical leaves. Beneath the soil, the rhizomes gradually expand and multiply, creating new pieces that can be harvested and replanted for the next season. When gardeners start growing crops like potatoes, garlic, ginger, and turmeric, something important becomes clear. These plants are built by nature to reproduce themselves again and again. A single piece can quietly expand into multiple harvests over time if it's simply given the right environment. That realization changes the way many people view the food in their kitchen. Instead of seeing a potato or a clove of garlic as something with a single purpose, you begin to recognize it as part of a living cycle, capable of continuing far beyond one meal. And once you start planting these multiplying crops in your garden, you begin to experience one of the most satisfying aspects of growing your own food. Watching something small gradually turn into abundance. Beyond roots, stems, and bulbs, there's another incredibly powerful way kitchen scraps can become food again, and that's through seeds. Every time you slice open a fruit or vegetable, you're often looking at dozens, sometimes hundreds of tiny future plants. Most of us scrape those seeds into the trash without thinking twice. But many of them are perfectly capable of growing into full productive crops if they're simply saved and planted. Once you start paying attention to this, you begin to realize that some of the food you buy at the grocery store already contains everything needed to start the next generation of plants. Tomatoes are one of the easiest and most rewarding examples of this. When you cut open a tomato, you'll see small clusters of seeds surrounded by the gel-like interior of the fruit. Each one of those seeds has the potential to grow into a completely new tomato plant. One simple method gardeners use is slicing a ripe tomato into thin rounds and placing those slices directly onto moist soil, covering them lightly with a thin layer of potting mix. Within a couple of weeks, tiny seedlings begin emerging from the soil in clusters. From there, the strongest seedlings can be separated and transplanted into their own pots or garden beds. Before long, those small plants grow into full tomato vines, capable of producing dozens of fruits over the course of a season. Peppers work in a very similar way. Inside every bell pepper, jalapeno, or chili pepper is a cluster of seeds attached to the inner membrane of the fruit. Instead of discarding them, those seeds can be removed, dried for a short period, and planted in warm soil. Given enough light and warmth, the seeds germinate and develop into pepper plants that will eventually produce their own fruits. Many gardeners enjoy experimenting with different pepper varieties this way, saving seeds from peppers they enjoy cooking with, and gradually building a diverse collection of plants in their garden. Strawberries offer an interesting twist because their seeds actually sit on the outside of the fruit rather than inside it. Those tiny specks covering the surface of a strawberry are technically individual seeds called achenes. With a bit of patience, these seeds can be planted to grow new strawberry plants. And once established, strawberry plants produce runners, long stems that extend outward and form new baby plants along the way. This means one successful strawberry plant can eventually spread into an entire patch, producing fruit season after season. Pineapple is another surprising candidate on this list. When you twist off the leafy crown at the top of a pineapple, you're actually removing the growing point of the plant. If that crown is cleaned and allowed to dry slightly before being placed in water or soil, roots can begin to form from the base. Over time, it grows into a striking tropical plant with long, spiky leaves. Pineapples are famously slow growers, sometimes taking a couple of years before producing fruit, but the process of growing one from a fruit top is incredibly satisfying. Avocados are perhaps one of the most well-known examples of seed regrowth. The large pit inside an avocado contains a complete embryo capable of growing into a tree. When suspended partially in water, the pit eventually cracks open and sends a root downward while a stem grows upward. While avocado trees grown from seed may take years to produce fruit, they become beautiful indoor or patio plants and offer a fascinating glimpse into the early stages of tree growth. What all of these examples share is a simple but powerful idea. Seeds are nature's way of carrying the future forward. Every fruit you eat is part of a cycle designed to continue life beyond that single harvest. By saving and planting even a small portion of those seeds, you participate in that cycle and transform ordinary kitchen scraps into the starting point of an entire garden. As we get closer to the end of this list, there's one more category of kitchen scraps that many people overlook completely. These are the parts of vegetables that might not regrow the original crop exactly as it was, but they still offer surprising value in the form of fresh edible greens, nutrients, or even future seeds. In many cases, these scraps are thrown away simply because people don't realize they are still useful. Yet, with a little patience, they can continue producing food long after the original vegetable has been used in the kitchen. Carrot tops are a perfect example of this. When most people prepare carrots, they cut off the thick top where the leafy greens once grew and discard it immediately. But that upper portion of the carrot still contains living plant tissue capable of growing again. By placing the cut top in a shallow dish with a small amount of water, delicate green leaves begin emerging within just a few days. These leaves have a mild flavor somewhat similar to parsley and can be used in salads, blended into pesto, or sprinkled over dishes as a garnish. While the carrot top itself won't grow a brand new carrot root, it can continue producing these fresh greens for quite some time if eventually moved into soil. And if the plant is allowed to grow through its full natural cycle, something even more interesting happens. The plant will eventually send up a tall flower stalk that produces clusters of tiny seeds. Those seeds can be collected and planted the following season, giving you the opportunity to grow an entirely new crop of carrots from a scrap that most people would never think twice about throwing away. Beet tops work in a very similar way. When beets are prepared in the kitchen, the top portion where the stems attach is often discarded. Yet this section can also regenerate leafy growth when placed in water and later transferred into soil. The resulting beet greens are not only edible, but extremely nutritious, packed with vitamins and minerals. They can be sautéed like spinach, added to soups, or chopped into salads for a slightly earthy flavor. In fact, many gardeners intentionally grow beets specifically for their greens as much as for the roots themselves. Another overlooked source of future plants comes from the seeds inside winter squashes. When you cut open a butternut squash, pumpkin, or similar vegetable, you'll find a cavity filled with seeds surrounded by soft pulp. While many people roast these seeds for snacks, a portion of them can also be cleaned, dried, and saved for planting. Once spring arrives and the soil warms up, those seeds can be planted directly into the garden where they quickly sprout and begin sending out long vines. Squash plants are famously productive, often producing multiple fruits from a single vine if given enough space and sunlight. Pumpkins follow the same pattern. One pumpkin can contain hundreds of viable seeds, far more than any one garden needs. Yet each of those seeds represents the potential for a new plant capable of producing several pumpkins of its own. Watermelons offer another similar opportunity. The seeds found inside many watermelons can be rinsed and dried, then planted once warm weather returns. With enough sunlight, water, and space to spread, watermelon vines grow rapidly across the ground and eventually produce large, sweet fruits that are incredibly satisfying to harvest. What makes these final examples so powerful is the reminder that nearly every part of a plant serves some purpose within nature's cycle. Even when a scrap doesn't regenerate the exact same vegetable you started with, it may still produce greens, seeds, or entirely new plants down the line. Once you begin recognizing these possibilities, the concept of food waste begins to shift dramatically. Instead of seeing scraps as the end of something, you start seeing them as the beginning of the next stage in the life of a plant. And that simple shift in perspective is often what turns a kitchen into the starting point of a thriving garden. Before we finish, there's one small but incredibly important tip that can dramatically increase your success when regrowing kitchen scraps, especially the ones you start in water. It's simple. It takes almost no effort, yet it makes a huge difference in whether those scraps develop strong, healthy roots or slowly rot before they ever get the chance to grow. The secret is changing the water frequently. When plant bases, stems, or roots sit in the same water for too long, that water begins to lose oxygen and slowly becomes a breeding ground for bacteria. Those bacteria attack the cut surfaces of the plant tissue, and once rot begins, it spreads quickly through the scrap. Many people try regrowing vegetables once or twice, see the plant turn soft or slimy, and assume the method simply doesn't work. In reality, the issue is usually not the plant itself, but the environment it's sitting in. Fresh water provides oxygen and keeps bacterial growth low, giving the plant the clean conditions it needs to develop new roots. Changing the water every day is ideal, but even every other day can dramatically improve the chances of success. Another helpful trick some gardeners use is adding a tiny drop of liquid seaweed fertilizer or another mild organic plant nutrient to the water. This provides a microdose of minerals and natural growth hormones that encourage root development without overwhelming the young plant. The key is using only the smallest amount because these scraps are still delicate in the early stages. Once healthy roots begin forming, the plant becomes much stronger and can eventually be transferred into soil where it continues growing normally. What makes this process so fascinating is how quickly plants respond when given the right conditions. A piece of vegetable that looked lifeless just days earlier suddenly sends out fresh white roots searching for nutrients. New leaves push upward toward the light. Within a short period of time, something that started as a kitchen leftover begins behaving like a thriving plant again. And when you see that transformation happen repeatedly, it starts to change the way you think about food entirely. Instead of seeing vegetables as disposable ingredients used once and forgotten, you begin to see them as living organisms that are part of an ongoing cycle. The onion root, the lettuce base, the sprouting potato, the seeds inside a fruit, each one carries the ability to continue growing if we simply give it the opportunity. Over time, these small experiments on a windowsill can grow into something much bigger. A few jars of regrowing scraps turn into pots of herbs, containers of vegetables, and eventually perhaps even a small garden outdoors. What began as curiosity slowly becomes a habit, and that habit becomes a lifestyle where growing food feels natural rather than complicated. And perhaps the most rewarding part of all is the realization that food independence doesn't always start with a large piece of land or an elaborate garden plan. Sometimes it starts with something incredibly small, the decision to pause for a moment before throwing something away and asking a simple question: could this grow again? As you begin experimenting with regrowing these kitchen scraps, something interesting tends to happen over time. What starts as a small curiosity, placing a few onion roots in a glass of water or planting a sprouting potato in a pot, gradually turns into a completely different way of thinking about food. You begin to notice the hidden life inside everyday ingredients. The vegetables on your cutting board stop looking like disposable items and start looking more like the early stages of a garden waiting to happen. The more you pay attention, the more you realize how many foods are designed by nature to reproduce themselves if given the opportunity. A tomato contains dozens of seeds capable of growing into vines loaded with fruit. A garlic bulb contains multiple cloves that can each become new plants. A simple herb stem can root and turn into an entire bush of fragrant leaves. Nature builds plants with this incredible ability to renew themselves again and again. And once you understand that cycle, it becomes difficult to ignore the potential sitting in your kitchen every day. For many people, this realization becomes the gateway into a deeper relationship with gardening. It begins with just a few jars on the windowsill. Maybe a green onion regrowing here, a basil cutting rooting there. But as the plants grow, curiosity grows with them. You start wondering what else can be propagated, what other scraps might come back to life, what vegetables could eventually move from the windowsill into the garden. Slowly, the process expands. A few containers appear on a balcony or patio. A small raised bed is added outside. Seeds saved from a summer tomato become next year's crop. What once felt like an experiment quietly turns into a system of growing food that continues year after year. And perhaps the most powerful part of this journey is the sense of connection it creates. When you regrow food from scraps, you participate directly in the life cycle of the plants you eat. You witness how resilient they are, how determined they are to grow again when given even the smallest chance. That experience changes the way you look at food waste, sustainability, and self-sufficiency. Instead of relying entirely on stores and supply chains, you begin reclaiming a small piece of the food system for yourself. Even if it starts with something as simple as a glass jar on a sunny windowsill, it reminds you that producing food is not as distant or complicated as it sometimes seems. It's a natural process that humans have been part of for thousands of years. And often the first step toward rediscovering that process begins not in a garden, but right in the kitchen, with the scraps most people never think twice about throwing away. And once you start seeing your kitchen this way, it becomes almost impossible to go back to the old habit of throwing everything away without thinking. Suddenly, the cutting board feels different. The scraps sitting there are no longer just leftovers from dinner preparation. They are possibilities. The root end of an onion becomes a plant waiting for water. The seeds inside a pepper become the beginning of next season's crop. Even the sprouting potato hiding in the back of the pantry stops looking like a mistake and starts looking like an opportunity. Over time, this small shift creates something powerful because gardening begins to blend naturally into everyday life. You're no longer separating gardening from cooking. Instead, the two become part of the same cycle. Food moves from the garden to the kitchen, and then from the kitchen back into the garden again. Scraps become seedlings, seedlings become plants, plants become meals, and the cycle continues. This simple loop is one of the foundations of sustainable gardening. And once you understand it, you begin to realize how many plants are designed to keep that cycle going almost endlessly. A single clove of garlic can become a full bulb, which contains several new cloves, which can all be planted again. One strawberry plant produces runners that create more plants each season. A tomato holds dozens of seeds capable of producing an entire row of plants the following year. When you think about food this way, abundance starts to feel less mysterious. It becomes something that grows naturally when plants are allowed to continue their life cycle rather than being treated as disposable products. And perhaps that's the most valuable lesson hidden inside these simple kitchen scraps. They remind us that food isn't just something we purchase and consume. It's something that grows, multiplies, and renews itself if we choose to participate in that process. Even a tiny windowsill garden can reconnect us to that idea. Watching fresh green shoots appear from something you nearly threw away creates a small moment of wonder, and those moments add up quickly. Before long, you're checking the jars on the windowsill each morning to see what new roots have formed, what new leaves have appeared, what tiny transformation has taken place overnight. That quiet excitement is often how a gardener is born. Not through complicated techniques or expensive equipment, but through curiosity and observation. Through the simple act of noticing that life continues growing if you give it the chance. So the next time you prepare a meal and find yourself standing over the trash can with a handful of vegetable scraps, pause for a moment. Look closely at what you're holding. Ask yourself whether that piece of food might still have one more chapter left in its story. Because very often, the beginning of your next harvest is already sitting right there in your kitchen, waiting for you to notice it. And maybe the most powerful thing about everything we've talked about today isn't just that these scraps can grow again. It's what that realization does to the way you see food. Because the moment you watch new roots forming on something you almost threw away, something shifts in your mind. You begin to see that food isn't just a product sitting on a grocery store shelf. It's part of a living cycle that has been repeating itself for thousands of years. Plants grow, they feed us, and inside many of them are the pieces needed to begin the process all over again. A tiny onion root becomes a fresh bundle of green shoots. A forgotten potato turns into a plant producing an entire harvest underground. A handful of seeds from a fruit can become the beginning of next season's garden. And once you experience that process even once, it becomes hard to ignore the potential hiding in the everyday ingredients we use. The truth is, growing food doesn't always require acres of land or years of experience. Sometimes it starts with something incredibly simple, a jar of water on a sunny windowsill, and the curiosity to see what might grow. So the next time you're preparing a meal and you find yourself about to toss those scraps into the trash, pause for just a second. Take a closer look at what you're holding. That little piece of vegetable might still have one more chapter left to grow. Try saving one scrap, just one, and give it a chance to regrow. Watch what happens over the next few days. You might be surprised at how quickly a simple kitchen experiment can turn into the beginning of a garden. And if you enjoy learning simple ways to grow more of your own food, consider subscribing because there are always more plants to discover, more techniques to explore, and more ways to turn everyday spaces into productive gardens. Until next time, keep your soil healthy, keep your curiosity alive, and keep growing something amazing.